Mary Lyn Hammer is a health and wellness advocate. She is an author and a Lyme disease and blood infection survivor. Her newest book is Over My Dead Body. Welcome to the show, Mary Lyn.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, excited to have you on. Tell us a little about your personal lives, more about your work, and why you do what you do.
Okay. Well, I own several businesses, and Champion for Life is the business that I have for helping people with their health. And I call it that because I nearly died with the blood infection. And so it's all around helping people to get their lives back after they've had chronic diseases, helping them get rid of the chronic diseases. And I specialize in Lyme disease. So my daughter and I both had Lyme. She was born with it. I was bit by the tick the first month of pregnancy. And so she developed in it and had it for the first 8 years of her life. And it was pretty rough on her. And so we healed from it in 2009. It was quite a journey. And for the first few years, I just kept getting tested and thinking, is it really gone? I guess, you know, I wanted to make sure it was really gone. And so, because a lot of people will say, well, why didn't you start helping people right away? And I did with people I knew. I was one of my dear friends growing up right after I healed. I went and got her. And I said, you're coming to Arizona. And she had been on disability for like 8 years and incredible person. She was our class valedictorian and she was just, dying. And I said, I want to bring you to Arizona. And she said, I don't know if I have time. And I was like, when did you leave the house last? Like, what are you talking about? And she said, well, I don't leave. And it was obvious that she didn't leave very often. And I said, well, let me put it this way. If you don't come with me, I think you're going to die. And she said, well, since you put it that way, I'll go with you. So I brought her down to Arizona and we did the things that we had figured out were the biggest impact on the Lyme disease. And within 6 months, she was Lyme free first. And she had bad Babesia. That was actually, and I found this to be consistent, the hardest co-infection to get rid of. And and 6 months later, she was doing aerobics classes and, got her life back. And she's a coach for kids' sports now. And so she was the first person that I helped. So we launched in right before COVID, actually. And then, then it was all about COVID. And so we've really just started going, strongly after that. And I just love helping people get their lives back.
What a, I mean, as a parent myself, I can't just being getting bit by a tick and you getting it, and it's the first month of pregnancy and your daughter's born with it. Awful.
Mhm. Yeah. And
Jeez.
people, I didn't know what was wrong with me.
Right.
It took 6.5 years to diagnose it, and I had been an extreme skier and a professional dancer. I was still performance dancing, and actually, I skied up until when my daughter was born. Um, I, so I was, you know, jumping out of helicopters. I mean, and I was rated in the top 5 to 10% of skiers in the world, even at 38 years old. And um, and then I decided it mattered if I busted my head open, so I had to slow down a little bit. But I was working out and getting weaker and weaker, and all of these things started happening um, with my health. And I kept hearing, well, at your age, and I'm thinking, I'm 40. What are you talking about? Like that's not old. And nobody could give me answers. And my primary physician was from Hawaii, so he had no experience with Lyme disease. And I kept going from doctor to doctor and trying things, and nothing was working. And um, I got to the point where I could barely walk up a flight of stairs. And Elizabeth was tired all the time. She had cognitive issues. her infection wasn't as severe as mine. So there was some kind of filtering that went on, but she caught it in utero. Um, and that was the most heartbreaking part of it when I was finally diagnosed and the doctor said, "Do you have any children?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "What symptoms do they have?" And my heart just sunk. And she was only 5 when we were diagnosed. So I was very determined to find answers. And I am naturally a researcher. I researched everything the doctors told me. They would say, we want to do this, and I would go research it. Um, and I have to say, probably um, the most important answers that I got really were through prayer, what I call God moments, because there's no explanation for how I got answers. And that's true to this day. I just, you know, I'll run into products or procedures or treatments or devices that help. So back then I had purchased an energetic device that it was about $20,000, but most of the cost of Lyme are not covered by insurance. And I did not want my daughter on all of these medications that I was on. She was on some, but I didn't, I was doing 12 IVs a week. I was taking about 300 pills a day. It was horrific. And injections, um, just just craziness. And I didn't want her to be on all this stuff when she was so young. So I bought this device and learned how to treat us, analyze our health and treat us. And so I would treat her for 3 days and I'd treat myself for 3 days and take the seventh day off. And then I'd bring it with me when I was getting my IVs, and everybody in the room, we used to call it the IV room, and everybody in the room had Lyme disease. And so I started running tests on everybody in the room and started seeing patterns. And like one of the things I figured out was that everybody resonated for tuberculosis, um, and it was a mutation. So it wasn't full-blown tuberculosis. And so I agreed to try streptomycin shots, which is a TB med. And well, I did that for 6 weeks, and the die-off was so much that I actually smelled like a rotting animal. It was terrible. And I was performing a cha-cha dance, and my one of my doctors was my dance partner. And it's like every time I raised my arm, I'd be like, "I'm so sorry."
Oh my gosh.
Because it was horrible. Um, but that was one of the things we figured out in about 2007. Um, and at the time, I thought it came in through vaccines. And in 2019, the NIH released a report saying that humans could contract tuberculosis from fear. And that's when I was like, ha. Because when I was writing my book, I thought, how am I going to explain this whole tuberculosis thing? Because it just, I found it energetically, but a lot of people don't believe in energetic medicine. I think it's actually the most accurate. Like I can run a scan and I get results. It would cost thousands and thousands of dollars to do all the testing that I can do in one scan.
Hmm.
And I have to look for patterns. And the Lyme people have specific patterns, and there's mutations. So it's very complicated because Lyme has 46 different DNA strands. Um, it mutates into 14 different life forms that I've found, um, or that I've found research for. I'm sure there's more because it's a very intelligent infection. And so you have to chase it. You can't just put people on one thing and leave them on that same thing for 6 months. It doesn't work that way. Um, you have to move around and outsmart it, and it's a little different on everybody. Um, and the other thing that I figured out that ultimately saved us and cured it on both the blood infection and the Lyme, and really I found it because of the blood infection. It was biofilm, the research about biofilm. It was very new back then.
Biofilm
Um,
or biofilm?
bi biofilm, and it's a fibrinogen material, and it's actually present in all chronic diseases. So the pathogen forms this biofilm to hide in. So when people are talking about being in remission, it's actually the pathogen is hiding in that biofilm. And so when they're on antibiotics, the the pathogen goes inside the biofilm to hide from the antibiotics. And then when they come off of it and they think they're in remission, they then the pathogen comes back out at some point after the antibiotics are out of the body. Then the pathogen comes back out. So that happens with all chronic illnesses, and even cancer has a biofilm.
Wow, that's really
Um,
interesting. It's I'm visualizing like something forming some kind of a cocoon and going inside of
it
the
it
cocoon.
it looks like that actually. Went right before they did the emergency surgery to take my IV port out. They were pulling blood out of it, and this white stuff started going into the syringe, the where they were drawing it, and it came in little pieces, and then it clumped together. It looked like styrofoam, and I'm kind of a smarty, so I so I said, if that's fat, can we take some out of my fat? But it looked
Stick
like
the needle right back
styrofoam.
here.
I've got a few places.
Yeah,
Um,
if you don't mind.
but but there was four doctors in the clinic and none of them had ever seen anything like it. And so they sent the whole syringe off to the lab and it came back fibrinogen. And I didn't think that much about it at that time. And that was in about July, and I nearly died the first week in September. Um, Went downhill very quickly. And the pain was tremendous. I mean, it was so painful that it made childbirth look like, a stub toe. And I didn't want to go on pain medicine because that's how I knew if an antibiotic was even working, because I would start feeling a little better,
Oof.
but then it would get worse. So I didn't want to be on anything that numbed that because they thought if they took me off of the antibiotic to find out what the exact infection was, that I would die. And I had turned gray and my hair fell out and my guts were falling out. Um, and I was laying in bed and praying I wouldn't die. And there wasn't an infectious disease doctor in the whole state of Arizona who would see me. I would get a hold of them and they'd start doing the intake and they'd say, so you had an IV for cancer? And I'd say, no, I had it for Lyme disease. And so we can't see you. And I said, I'm not asking you to treat the Lyme disease. I'm asking you to treat the blood infection. And they would turn me away.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
That's terrible.
I know I literally called every infectious disease doctor in the state of Arizona. So
We
I
should
was
call them now and tell them to F off.
Yeah. Yeah, there were some interesting things at a hospital up in Montana. I had a home in Montana and a home in Arizona, and I'd gone into the emergency room there. My doctor called ahead of time and said, give her this IV antibiotic and stabilize her so she can get back to Arizona. And they refused to give me the antibiotic. They asked me about 10 times if I wanted a prescription for pain medicine, and I kept saying, I don't take pain medicine. There was no pain medicine in my blood. They ran thyroid tests. They did chest x-rays. I had just had the IV port taken out. It was pretty obvious I had a blood infection. Like I had a incision in my chest. And they just kept asking about pain meds. And at 2:30 in the morning, he said, we don't think you're going to die tonight, so just go home and get back to Arizona. Like they did nothing. And I almost died because of that. And so the it was Labor Day week, and one of the therapists kept saying, "You have the same patterns as this woman who died from a blood infection. Her husband found out the name of it right before she died, but it was too late." And she said she was still in touch with them. And I said, "Would you please call him and get the name of it?" And she did. And he said, and it was on a Tuesday, and he said, I'm out of town and I'll be back on Friday and I'll get it to you. And she said, "I don't think she's going to last that long." And so he called his son, and the son went over and got his mom's records and gave us the name of the infection, and they got me on the right antibiotic. And that that saved my life. And I've never met them. I wrote them a thank you note, and the therapist gave it to them. So my life was saved by two strangers. And it took about 6 weeks from that point for me to be able to walk across a room. And so at Christmas time, my daughter and I were both, significantly better. And I said, "We've got to get all this medication out of us. We're doing a cleanse." And we did this green spruce cleanse because she was still young. She was 7. And and we did this green spruce cleanse, and we both became very sick. And went back to the doctor, and he said, "Your blood infection is back." And I freaked out because I had crossed over several times actually. That's why my book is called Over My Dead Body. I crossed over, and it was terrifying because I didn't want to leave my daughter. And um, so he was on the phone with the pharmacist, and I was reading the research about the blood infection on his computer, and it said it had a biofilm, and I just knew that that was the key. And I said, Doctor, this has a biofilm, and so does Lyme." And so that's how we started figuring out that component of it. And we figured out that the enzymes in the green spruce cleanse, the plant and fruit enzymes, were dissolving the biofilm and letting the pathogens back out. So we did this protocol where we rotated through various enzymes at the same time we were on antibiotics. And about 6 weeks later, um, my daughter came home from school and she said, "Mommy, this is the best Monday of my life." And I said, "Why, honey?" And she said, "Because I'm not tired." And that's when I knew that we got it. And I was on this protocol for a longer period than that just because I had the blood infection also. But she was Lyme free at that point. And I had kept her active the whole time because I just didn't want her muscles atrophying. And so she was in gymnastics, and she had been with the same teacher for years. And she was just in the second grade. And she won the handstand contest at the year-end event. And it was um, prior to that, she would have to lay down in between each event
Well,
because she was so tired. And she won the handstand contest, and the teacher looked at me, and the gym was packed, all the parents, everybody, because it was the end of the year show. And she said, "Can I share Elizabeth's story?" And I said, "Yes." And so she said, "This is so much more than a handstand contest for this child." And she told him that she had had Lyme disease and had been sick her whole life, and that that was a major turning point for her. And everybody, this mother was sitting next to me, and she said, "Oh my God, I'm bawling, and she's not even my child." And that was the beginning of it. And so from there, we had to build our bodies back up, our immune systems. And because especially for my daughter, she had never been well. So anytime she got a little cold, she'd get 104 fever, like her body just went crazy because, the immune system's like, "Oh no, we're sick again." and
Right.
it would overreact. And so we had to retrain it to act properly and build up the body. And so it was a series of detoxes and building up the immune system and really reprogramming the body to work again.
Incredible.
And so now I have it down to 4 to 6 months. Because the research never stops. I released the book 4 years ago, and I've learned so much since then. And anything I can do to make it happen faster for people, I want to do. Um, because some of these people come to me, they've had Lyme for 30 years or longer, and you just want them to feel better. And so I have people that, after a few months, they're out hiking with their kids that they've never been able to do that. I have a minister I worked with, and she called 3 weeks into the um, the Lyme Crusher protocol, and she called and she said, "I did a wedding this weekend, and I was on my feet all day, and it didn't wipe me out." And she said, "I even danced." And sorry, I'm like I cry over a lot of things, but just the feeling knowing that what I've learned can help people, you know, do things that they haven't been able to do for years. I had one lady say, I just had a normal period, and I haven't had a normal period in 7 years. And because it makes your blood very thick and viscose. And so you have, um, it's kind of hard to understand. And we actually found that before I was diagnosed, and we were doing an experiment with my doctor, and he had several of us, and they put my blood up under a wet slide, and everybody was like, "What is up with your blood?" And it looked like a choo-choo train. It was like flattened, and it was all stuck together. And that was the Lyme disease, but we didn't know it at the time. So the some of the things that I've figured out since then is that the biofilm, where it forms in somebody, and it's different on everybody, um, that determines the symptoms.
Hmm.
So like when it's on your nerves and it forms in the extremities, then you get the neuropathy. Like my feet had been numb for about 5 years. I had tinnitus in my ears. It was all about 5 years when I was diagnosed. I had had migraine for 5 years. I had had tinnitus. I couldn't hear. I couldn't feel my feet. Um, and as I got rid of it, all of those symptoms went away. And one of the funny stories is with my feet that I was in Washington, D.C., and my other business is student loans, and I was up on the hill all day, and we were walking to get dinner. And I said, God, my feet hurt. And then I was like, wait a minute, my feet hurt. And I'm jumping for joy, and everybody's going, what is wrong with you? I'm like, you don't understand. I haven't felt my feet in years. And so for me, feeling that pain was
Awesome.
a miracle. Yeah. So, I can hear, they told me they didn't know if my organs would ever work right again. However, everything works perfectly except for my thyroid, but I'm on about a third of the medicine I used to be on. That's the only thing I'm on, and I'm turning 64 next month. So,
Incredible.
yeah.
I'm sure the medical community is knocking down your door to talk with you about how they can change the way that they diagnose and treat Lyme disease now.
They're starting to, at first,
I
and
was
I
I was
still get
being
a lot of
facetious,
pushback.
so I'm I'm
Yeah.
I'm I'm glad they actually are.
I was actually on a podcast not long ago with a doctor, and he really wanted to know the enzymes, but I don't know um, the exact protocol until I do the scans because, like I said, there's so many different factors, and you have to take into consideration their medical history. So, like when we go into the phase where we're treating the pathogens and dissolving the biofilm, I have to know everything about their past because if they had any kind of scary infection like MRSA, you know, in their past, we have to be ready to hit that because when the pathogens come out of the biofilm, everything comes out, and you have to be ready for that.
Hmm.
Um, so that's probably the most intense part of the treatment is when we get to that phase. And enzymes also thin the blood, so you have to work with the doctors, if somebody's on blood thinners, which a lot of people with Lyme are, because like I said, they get that viscose blood. But the traditional blood thinners don't dissolve the biofilm. They just thin the blood. So you have to wean them, like be strategic about it so the blood isn't too thin because if they cut themselves, they'll never stop bleeding. So we
Right.
have to be very careful about that and work with the doctors to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Incredible,
Yeah.
Mary Lynn.
Yeah.
Incredible. What a story. Great
Thank you.
job.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very, and my attitude is I don't want patients for a lifetime. I want friends for a lifetime. And I'm very close with everybody that I've ever worked with because you become their champion. And, um, there's nothing better than seeing people going out and enjoying their lives and, you know, being able to do the things that they love doing. And I want to get them there as fast as possible. There's tons of people with Lyme disease. And before COVID, it was the fastest growing epidemic in 6 continents. It's it's out there. People don't know anything about it, and some of the information is just now coming out, like that it can be passed in utero.
Hmm.
Um, they're just releasing all of this information from the government, so people didn't know that before. And when I treat people, I have to look at the whole family, and it's also sexually transmitted, which is not out there, and it should be. It should be on the list of STDs.
For sure. My
It's the
goodness.
same pathogen as syphilis.
Hmm.
So syphilis is a spirochete, so is Lyme disease. So, even rationally thinking, you would know that it is sexually transmitted. So you have to also, treat the husband or their partners or whatever. Otherwise, they just keep giving it back and forth. You can't really get somebody well if their partner
Hmm.
is not treated.
Fascinating.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Well, Mary Lynn, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people learn more about you? Where can they learn more about your work? How can they engage with you? Where can they get their copy of Over My Dead Body?
Well, we have a website, championforlife.com. We also have a program, our protocol is called the Lyme Crusher, and we're all over the place on social media, Facebook and Instagram. We have a few other platforms also that we're building. And so any of those places, we are available. And the book's available on Amazon or on my website, either one. Um, and like I said, I've learned a lot since then. So, the things that we post have information about that. And, we just want to keep improving the process. And like I added superfoods at the beginning of the year. Um, and man, these people are just blasting through this stuff where it really supports their body's ability to get through the process faster because it builds up their strength faster. And that made a huge difference in my clients. And so that was pretty exciting. And that's when we had it in about 6 months, but I had one gal that just 4 months later, and she'd been sick for years, years and years, and in about 4 months, she was she did everything that I told her to do, though. So people, you have to be dedicated to your healing. And, a lot of people are afraid of healing. because their support group becomes the Lyme groups.
Hmm.
And so, you, I can't tell you how many times you hear, well, you look fine and you're dying inside. And people don't understand. And the divorce rate is super high for people who have Lyme disease because their spouse gets tired of them saying they feel bad. And um, and so it's really rough on relationships, and you don't get a lot of support from people who, can't relate to what you're going through. And so their support becomes their groups, and they have a hard time. Um, it's almost like, well, if I get well, then I don't have any friends at all, is the feeling that they have. And so I always ask people to take a look at the word Lyme, and if you divide it into two, it's lie and me.
Hmm.
And so I ask everybody I work with, what lie are you telling yourself? What are you lying to me about? And a lot of the people have been through like abusive childhoods and things like that. And they have this core belief that they don't deserve to be better. And if you don't believe that you deserve to get well, you won't get well. There's a physical component, but there's definitely an emotional component that people have to work through. And, I also tell them that we can use the tragedies in our lives to as an excuse for our choices or for a reason for making a change. And so if you look at it like I know that I got Lyme disease so that I could help others. In fact, when I crossed over, my little brother who died the same year I was born, he was 2 weeks before his fourth birthday, and I grew up in an abusive home. And he was standing at the tunnel of light. And I said, "Oh, you're here to take me into the light." And he said, "No, I'm here to tell you it's not your time. You're going back. And, you're not done yet. And this is one of the reasons I'm not done yet, is to help others." So if if you look at it like, you can't heal in others what you haven't healed in yourself. And the Lyme warriors are all about, getting well and sharing that with others. You don't have to leave your people behind. You need to bring them and make them a warrior too. And, and spread the healing instead of spreading the attitude that there's nothing that can change this. Because science is miraculous and we find answers every day. And the more people we share that with, the more people will get well.
What a story. Well, if you enjoyed this much as I did, show Mary Lynn your appreciation. Share today's show with a friend who also appreciates good ideas, and certainly anybody suffering from chronic conditions and certainly Lyme disease. Go to championforlife.com. Check out everything that Mary Lynn and I have been talking about today. Check out the Lyme Crusher Protocol. Pick up Over My Dead Body on Amazon or her website and start educating yourself and feeling better. Thanks again, Mary Lynn.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Until next time, remember, do your part by doing your best.